In this video, we'll be having a look at the long and troubled development of Windows 95, and towards the end I'll upgrade my 386 PC with Windows 95. This is a long video with a lot of talking, so if you're just here for the upgrade, you can jump to this timestamp. For the development story, I'll be looking at it from two perspectives. First, the internal Microsoft story, as told by the documents released as part of the Combs vs. Microsoft class action lawsuit. Secondly, what was reported in media, specifically Swedish print media, because I'm Swedish. I'll try to keep track of the main technological aspects as reported internally versus media on this board. The release of Windows 95 was a big thing, with launch events held around the world. It celebrated innovations like the new user interface. But did Microsoft really spend several years developing a new user interface, only to spend $200 million advertising it because they were so excited for us to know about it? Or was there more to this story? The breadcrumbs start in August of 1990. Microsoft had just shipped Windows 3.0 and was likely starting to think about what should go into 4.0. At this point, Windows will have an object-oriented GUI. Object-oriented was a buzzword almost as bad as client-server during the 90s, so I guess this makes sense. Microsoft had just broke up with IBM over OS/2, so they had this half-developed new 32-bit operating system that was going to be OS/2 3.0. And Microsoft was intending to adapt WinAPI to this new 32-bit platform. Now the talk goes, should the 32-bit Windows API just be a stretch of the 16-bit one, or should it add stuff like process safety and preemption? And what future versions of Windows will support this new object-oriented shell? One thing's for sure, Microsoft wants the Presentation Manager APIs, which is the OS/2 GUI APIs, to be a dead end. But don't tell anyone. Microsoft also realizes that backwards compatibility is important, noteworthy as Windows 3 wasn't really binary compatible with Windows 2.0 apps. Software is expensive and users want to protect their investments. Work was also put into something Microsoft called information at your fingertips, with the goal of making information effortless and easy to find. Not only should the user interface be object-oriented, maybe the file system should be too. There was quite a bit of focus on the network and the possibility of offloading computation to other nodes. By November, things were starting to crystallize out. An extended Windows API would become core in Microsoft's Windows Everywhere strategy, where the API to target should always be WinAPI. This Win32 API will target anything with a 386SX with 2 MB of RAM and up, from Windows on DOS to NT Windows on OS/2 3.0. It will include preemption, multi-threading, memory protection and security. Windows 4.0 will also bring us information at your fingertips. The Windows 4.0 team would accomplish this with a new data storage model, content indexing and a new shell. This was their focus. We would also see a merger of the file manager and the program manager. At this point, it's unclear if the Win32 API will arrive on Windows 3.20. There will be Win32 on 16-bit Windows as well as Win16 on 32-bit Windows. Fast forward a bit to March 91 and we see a suggestion to include MS-DOS with Windows 4. MS-DOS was Microsoft's cash cow, so Microsoft was hesitant to discontinue it. But Microsoft also had a seething hatred for DOS clones, especially DRDOS. What Microsoft absolutely did not want to see was Windows running on a competitor's DOS clone. We would see this shine through with the AARD code in the Windows 3.1 beta. By May 1991, Microsoft was starting to feel the pressure from an upcoming OS/2 release, and desperately needed to get Windows 3.1 out of the door. Windows 3.1 would be a satisfaction release, with stopgap measures to make Windows more stable, like actually checking handles coming from application code. Aside from stability improvements, the release would also get some polish and usability upgrades. This satisfaction release would take resources from the Windows 4 project, but OS/2 just couldn't be allowed to be the better OS. Around this time, an internal memo circulated painting a doomsday scenario if IBM was successful in marketing OS/2 2.0. It could be real trouble for Microsoft. We also see some more talks about merging MS-DOS and Windows. Microsoft also started working on an OEM product they codenamed Slick, which would combine the MS-DOS and Windows 3 installers into one. We also get to see the first ideas for this merged DOS, where Microsoft intended to extend DOS itself into a 32-bit protected mode and multitasking system, capable of loading Windows VXT drivers. This would be the foundation to build Windows 4 on. In July, IBM demoed test applications that would crash Windows and used this in their marketing. Microsoft responded by developing some of their own to crash OS/2. Stability was considered important enough that Bill Gates got into the discussion. At this point, Windows 4 was about 2 years away for a release in late '93. It will bring 32-bit applications to mainstream Windows. In October, we get a glimpse at how much Microsoft hated DRDOS. To quote the question in the email directly, "Check with legal how close developers can get to DRDOS before we have to shoot them." If we look at the board now, we can already see the starting outline of what Windows 4 would be like. By March '92, Windows 93 is now Project Chicago. It will be an integrated DOS Windows product, but they might rip the DOS bits out and sell separately as DOS 7.0. It will run on a 386 with 4 MB of RAM. It will not have a new user interface, and it is to be released in Q3 of '93. It will have a service release of Microsoft APIs, but no big new ones. All exciting developments has been moved to Cairo, which is based on NT and will target 8 MB of RAM. The primary goal with Chicago is to get a small 32-bit system with preemptive multitasking out of the door. As a quick side note for those of you watching who didn't study computer science, here's the big deal with preemptive multitasking. Multitasking on these old systems with just one processor core is an illusion. It's quickly switching between programs, running them one at a time. Preemptive multitasking allows the operating system to pretty much whenever it feels like interrupt the program running and switch to something else. This is in contrast to cooperative multitasking, where the running program has complete control and the OS can't switch to something else until the program hands over control. The latter made the system sensitive to hangs from buggy programs, and it meant it was difficult to run multimedia applications as the OS couldn't easily take back control to refill the audio buffer, for example. All new proper operating systems did preemptive multitasking, including OS2 and Unix. Cooperative multitasking was starting to look obsolete and is something Windows 3 and Mac OS did. By June, Microsoft made up its strategy a bit regarding Chicago. It will be so good it will put OS2 in its grave. It will be tightly integrated with DOS, but you should never need to drop into DOS like you do on Windows 3. It will bring plug and play to Windows, and it will be fast, beating Windows 3 on the same hardware. It might add virtual desktops to reduce screen clutter. It might use the NT registry to tame the mess caused by configsys, autoexec.bat and the various INI files. It will standardize a way to install and remove applications, and it will release to manufacturing in September of '93. Which was very, very, very optimistic. In September of '92, the big document lands. The Chicago Feature Specification. It's a 276-page specification covering most things that should go into Chicago. It asserts things we've seen previously. Chicago needs to be as fast or faster than Windows 3.1 on DOS 5, running on a 386 DX20 with 4 MB of RAM. Long file names are on the wishlist, but not a must. They considered previewing the text of a minimized DOS window in the icon. We also get the first hint that Microsoft wants to ship Chicago on a CD-ROM. TCP/IP is not expected to be included. There is no plans for any other file system than FAT. And maybe allow NT to be upgraded to Chicago? The start diskette that we all know and love for its uselessness is in the spec. An interesting idea is to allow non-critical Windows components to be installed to a different partition. FDisk will not be updated, and the 3-component 5-stage installer we'll see later is also outlined. Plug and play will be a big focus, but it's important not to make NT look bad, and likely no Unicode support. But what about East Asia then? Multi-monitor support was also discussed, but we are now back to Chicago getting a new shell, based on the Cairo Milestone 4 build. This will also include small stuff like proportional handles on the scroll bars. In October, it is again clarified that Chicago will ship as early as possible. It will not wait for Cairo. Cairo was at this point Microsoft's object-oriented NT, as part of their vision to implement information at your fingertips. In December, we can see that at least someone at Microsoft is considering describing Chicago as NT Lite. Microsoft was starting to realize at this point that the first edition of NT, which they still hadn't shipped, was going to run like an absolute dog on contemporary hardware. Okay, we're starting to get some clutter on the board, but I hope you're still following along. Things will get a lot messier now, as media starts covering Windows Chicago. In January of '93, Microsoft is asking themselves how much they should distance themselves from DOS. It's a large chunk of their profits, but it's also giving their platform a bad reputation as obsolete and unreliable. We also get a status report on the Chicago project. It will get a new user interface. It must do long file names, and it still targets a 4MB FreeBSD. It is now delayed to Q1 '94 and is apparently already self-hosting. Self-hosting means that you can do all development of the OS on the OS you're developing. The press has also gotten the word about Chicago, and a number of computer magazines talked about it. PC Week got a couple things wrong, like Chicago being a stripped-down version of NT. At the very least, the word about Chicago got out prematurely and seemingly a bit uncontrolled. Microsoft themselves don't really confirm much with the public, other than it being the next version of Windows on DOS, offering 32-bit APIs. They do confirm in that statement that there will be new versions of MS-DOS. In February, it's obvious that the stability improvements in Windows 3.1 wasn't enough. Bill Gates is starting to get really worried about the stability of Windows running 16-bit apps. NT was going to solve that problem, but it's even more apparent now that the first release of NT is not going to perform well. Given how much Microsoft had trash-talked IBM and OS2 for its bloated and inefficient code, I sense a great deal of irony here. In March, we get to hear a few more things about the new GUI. The idea about the tiny font in minimized DOS windows isn't dead yet, and the tray is a convenient place to store frequently accessed objects. We'll get back to that one. There is also a special folder with recently accessed files. In April of '93, it's obvious that Chicago development has hit a few snags. Bill Gates himself wondered why the kernel stuff is so screwed up, and describes the Chicago project as out of control. More specifically, the schedule is slipping due to the 32-bit migration. Adding preemptive multitasking to a system that is not designed for it is hard, and it easily gets screwed up in the most wonderful way. Getting a proper 32-bit OS to run on only 4 MB of RAM is hard. They even considered using P-code, like they did in early WinWord versions, to keep the size down. It went so poorly that they considered keeping the core 16-bit and funked 32-bit calls down to 16-bit, just like Win32s on Windows 3. As far as the schedule goes, Milestone 3 shipped to a small number of independent software vendors in March. That have Win32s level API support and no new shell. Milestone 4 will have most of the new APIs, as well as the new shell. Milestone 5 will have a 32-bit shell, plus tuning of the 32-bit components. Milestone 6 is the large-scale beta, that is mostly feature complete. Bill Gates is also a strong proponent of MDI and thinks Chicago should use it more. MDI is this thing when each document opens inside a main window for the program. We also get to see some internal controversy regarding how applications and, in this case, the languages team uses their access to the Windows source code to do things using undocumented APIs. Specifically, in this email from Raymond Chen, we can see how Visual C++ uses a private and internal API in a way that works on Windows 3 but breaks on Chicago. The languages team did this fully knowing that it wouldn't be stable between versions, but decided to go ahead anyway. This is now causing quite a mess. Now consider this in the context of what was called the Chinese Wall. Microsoft officially claimed that their applications team didn't get an unfair advantage from their access to the Windows source code and thus unofficial APIs. Microsoft had, to calm their independent software vendors, promised to only use documented APIs in their applications, and document the undocumented ones they used. Internally at Microsoft, however, it seems that this access was used without much judgment. In May, we see the first mention of something called WritePad, which will replace Notepad and Write. We also get to see why the card file application wasn't carried forward. Microsoft considered the built-in address book to be the replacement. There's also a list of things that work. Quite a lot of things, but a lot of things are still 16-bit. For Milestone 4, there are some big new features. Long file names, preemptive multitasking, and a new setup is 3 of them. Milestone 5 will still be the big 32-bit update. Steve Ballmer thinks that Chicago should get a name that is a bit more special than just Windows 4 and that could be used to market applications taking advantage of Windows Chicago. We also see that the standalone version of MS-DOS isn't dead yet. The question is, will it just be Chicago without the GUI, or is it more standalone than that? Regardless, MS-DOS 7 would likely be the last DOS. In the press meanwhile, we now know that Chicago is the next big mainstream version of Windows. It will combine MS-DOS 7 and Windows for Workgroups. DOS will become a real 32-bit operating system, with support for more file systems than just FAT. It will be optimized for a 4MB FreeBSD and it's going to be released during 1994. By June, there is a worry that the Win32 API will get fragmented. The Chicago team is extending and enhancing APIs a lot, and it isn't carried over to NT. In the press, we hear that Win32 will be part of Windows 4.0 and it will integrate DOS. This particular magazine apparently didn't get the memo that this isn't NT Lite and that it's built on DOS instead of NT. It's also likely that there's going to be a separate MS-DOS release without Windows. It won't have a 32-bit API, but it will be able to run multiple programs at once. This wouldn't be the first time that Microsoft attempts a multitasking DOS. In July, Microsoft shows Chicago to the press for the first time. One of the highlighted features is the new Explorer, which combines File, Printer and Program Manager into one. In August, we get more details on how Microsoft imagined they will rip DOS out of Chicago and make its own product out of it, codenamed Chico. It would be a multitasking DOS and you would be able to Alt-tab between running MS-DOS programs. It would inherit plug-and-play from Chicago, complete with a registry, although it was unclear how you would manage that in practice. For the full version of Windows, we can also tell that the intention was to include a graphical disk partitioning tool called WinDisk. Press claims Chicago will be released second half of 1994, and that the next version of MS-DOS will be built on its technology. In September, we hear that Chicago will be 32-bit and have true preemptive multitasking, and it will run most software written for Windows NT. In October, we can tell that Microsoft doesn't like the idea of OEMs adding their own easy-to-use shells on top of Windows, especially not with Chicago. Which is funny to me because Utopia, or Microsoft Bob as it was released as, is exactly that. We're also seeing some concern that it might be too much work to rip DOS out of Chicago. If MS-DOS 7 happens, it will likely be a stripped-down Chicago with enough GUI bits to run the system management parts. Microsoft is feeling the pressure from OS 2. They need a client with good multitasking that will run great with 8 megs of RAM, and NT ain't it. It likely won't be until after 1996 that NT could become a mainstream client platform. There is also a mention of the upcoming Chicago replacement codenamed Memphis, which is intended to be the object-oriented client for Cairo. Meanwhile, in the press, we get to see some pictures of the new user interface and even more details. According to this article, apparently, Chicago won't be built on MS-DOS, but it will have full compatibility with existing applications. It will support plug-and-play, it might have a new file system, and the alpha is surprisingly stable. OLE 2 is also marketed. OLE 2 is a pretty big part of Microsoft's strategy. The vision is that you'd make composite documents that combine parts from multiple programs, all accessed in one user interface. OLE 2 was an evolutionary step towards that, as it allowed objects from one program to be embedded into another. Additionally, it will support long file names on FAT, and apparently the NT file system. And all of this will work on 4 megs of RAM. Other noteworthy points is the ability to have nested program groups. There is also the Twins file synchronization, probably what was named Briefcase in the final version. It's also going to use the NT registry instead of INI files, and you can change the screen resolution without restarting your computer. In December, internal testing shows that Windows for Workgroups 3.11 breaks Windows support in OS 2, so Microsoft is excited to quickly get OEMs to ship that instead of 3.1. While this particular wrench in the OS 2 machinery was temporary, a big reason Microsoft wanted to make Win32 mainstream as soon as possible was to sabotage the Windows compatibility in OS 2. As for development, feedback from the Milestone 4 testing showed that the new shell is not liked. It's different and unfamiliar without really offering any advantages. It would also be until Milestone 5 until 32-bit app support was any good. There is also this idea floating around to split Windows 95 into 2 editions to maximize revenue, a base and a pro edition. Base might have limitations like no networking, limited to 8 megs of RAM, you can't add fonts, no extra applets, or maybe no double space. So, let's have a look at the board again. Most of the technical details, as decided internally by Microsoft, had been reported in the press by this time. There's also some misunderstandings we are awaiting corrections for. The pictures we've seen so far are likely from the Chicago 58S preliminary development kit build, which was leaked and widely circulated. This was a Milestone 4 build. While the user interface was never claimed to be finished, it was finished in the sense that it was ready for evaluation. Since it's quite different from what was eventually shipped, let's have a quick tour and poke at it before moving on. The setup itself is pretty bare bones, but it gets the job done. You do need to launch it from an existing Windows 3 installation. I can pick where it'll install Chicago, and that is then followed by a bewildering driver selection screen. There is basically no information to enter, just click next a couple times and it will start installing. After the setup, we get a glorious boot screen, neatly hiding the MS-DOS foundation. On first boot, it converts my old program manager group and then launches into the desktop, with a fair number of dialogues to the face. One of the first things I notice is that the minimize and maximize buttons are no longer arrows. The maximize button is the outline of a large window, while minimize seems to represent a small tile at the bottom of the screen that it'll turn into when you minimize. Fairly similar to how it worked on Windows 3. Accessing them is a bit different though. Clicking on a tile allows you to restore the window, just like in Windows 3. You can press Ctrl Escape, just like in Windows 3, to access a task list, where you can switch between programs. Cool Switch, or Alt-Tab as we know it, is also carried over from Windows 3.1, although it seems to be busted. But there is also this middle button on the taskbar that allows you to access the global window menu. Aside from Run, there is no way to launch programs from the Start menu. That is done from the Programs folder on the desktop. The third button is for help and such. The About dialog is quite familiar and is showing us the amount of RAM and GDI handles free. Opening the cabinet, or Explorer as it would later be known, we get to see the drives in the system. Accessing the floppy disk is completely broken in this build. This Explorer combines the old file cabinet application as well as Program Manager, Print Manager and a control panel. It's all just objects now. Video codecs and playback is already in Windows at this point, which is cool to see. Snooping around in the system folder, I did find regedit, but it's still the old Windows 3.11 registry, not the NT registry. Given the amount of loose INI files rattling about in the system directory, I guess they haven't gotten around to it yet. In fact, most of the utility programs are the same ones from Windows 3, so there isn't too much to see here. There's also right-clicking now in Explorer, where we find some of the options we know today. The Properties dialog is recognizable even in this early version. Long file names work in Explorer, which, judging from all the short file name hacks around the system, appears to be a recent accomplishment. Although the common dialogues for file operations have not yet been updated, it appears. Shortcuts, or links as they are called here, are also implemented. In this version of Chicago, the process for creating them is a two-stage process, just like copy-paste is. In this folder menu, there is also a reference to a personal directory. Windows 98 would add a My Documents folder, but Windows 95 didn't. I wonder if this is an early manifestation of that idea. Right-clicking on the desktop, we can get to the display properties. In the display properties, aside from being able to set the background image and screensaver, there is now the monitor option that allows you to change the resolution without rebooting. There is also a screen metrics tab. Microsoft at this point thought it would be important for programs to accurately scale graphics to physical measurements, so these settings have a prominent place in this version. Finally, let's have a look at the control panel. Most of it is still the old Windows 3 stuff. We do see this disks option. This was the intended replacement for fdisk. Windows 95 ended up shipping without a GUI utility for partitioning drives. This WinDisk control panel applet was how they planned to do it. It's completely non-functional in this build. Later builds would fix it, but partitioning was nowhere to be seen. Looking at the system option, we get a familiar-ish system summary. There's also a tab for search path and environment variables that is completely non-functional, as well as some virtual memory settings. In Advanced System, we get to see the beginnings of a device manager, a critical component in this new plug-and-play support, as well as some system limits that we can't change. Oh, and then there's this white area. This is the so-called tray, and it's a convenient place to store objects that you're working with a lot. And that's all I want to show in Build 58S, so let's shut down and have a look at this dialog. I don't think this bit of graphics exists in any other version of Windows. In January of '94, Microsoft internally concluded that restricted beta ID checks in Milestone 5 with watermarking of binaries was successful in preventing leaks. Microsoft did not want a repeat of the 58S leaks. Around this time, Microsoft was also starting to realize the importance of the internet. The end goal is to reshape the internet such that Microsoft and Windows plays a central role in it. This will assert the importance of including TCP/IP in Chicago, but the browser won't be in the core product. There's also plans for a CD version of Chicago, with encrypted Office apps on it that could be decrypted with a license key. They also hadn't dropped the idea of having a premium build of Chicago to wring out more revenue. Ideas for features to remove from the base version now includes preemptive multitasking, networking, extra fonts, double space and such. In the media, we hear that WritePad will replace Notepad and Write from Windows 3. A multimedia player and codecs will also be included. By this point, Microsoft was getting closer to their 32-bit target with Chicago, although quite a bit of 16-bit code still remained. In February, it's reported that the first beta version is delayed. It will include a new user interface, as the one showed previously was a bit too radical for most users. In April, Microsoft is still not sure about MS-DOS 7. They will build it if people ask for it. It will be Chicago without a graphical user interface, but it will be a strange product. If there is demand, it will ship after Chicago. In the news, there is rumor that Chicago won't get a new file system, and thus no long file names. The multitasking is reportedly very good, so good that you can download files over the modem while formatting a floppy. This doesn't sound like much, but each of these two tasks will get your computer onto its knees, regardless of how powerful it is. The new user interface is also shown. A big change is the single start button, and the tray area is now filled with buttons representing open windows, equivalent to the old global window menu. And despite the earlier rumor, long file names sure are in Chicago, thanks to the backwards compatible extension of FAT. The final name for Chicago is not known, but Windows 4.0 seems like a logical one. But already by May, it's looking like Windows 95 is the release name for Chicago. Microsoft is still claiming that Windows 95 will perform as well or better than Windows 3.1 on a 386 with 4 MB of RAM. This is also mentioned in the review guide for the beta released around this time. The target is still to ship in the second half of '94, despite the first beta not being out yet. In the media, we get some more pictures of the user interface, which is pretty much finalized. The rumor about there not being long file names is corrected. The old program manager and file manager will be included with Chicago. Plug and play is also highlighted as an important new feature. There is also a claim that Chicago will know what the type of a file is without the file ending. macOS and OS2 could do this with resource forks and extended attributes respectively. What Microsoft did here was to hide the extension by default, apparently not to confuse novice users. In June, as development was seemingly starting to wrap up, Microsoft started working on their plan to crush OS2. This plan mostly revolved around portraying OS2 as a dead-end technology that ran Windows apps poorly. But then there's this magazine article reminding us that there is no revolutionary technology in Chicago. Its main redeeming features are already available today in OS2. The key difference will be the market share. OpenGL support is apparently postponed to the version coming after Chicago, and Chicago will likely get delayed to 1995. We also hear that Chicago will have better DOS compatibility than NT, and the support for laptop docking stations is improved. Minor feature improvements include shortcuts for gathering things in one place and proportional scroll bars. Chicago will also include TCP/IP and a game development API called WinG. Both of these shipped as optional components for Windows 3. In August, we get some more coverage of Chicago. Reviewers like the new user interface, and the notepad and write replacement, WritePad, is good. Users like the full window drag feature, that moving a window doesn't just preview an outline. If your graphics card drivers hasn't been updated, the old Windows 3 drivers will work. But this article also criticizes the poor multi-boot support. What if you want to run both Windows, DOS, OS2 and Linux on the same computer? Microsoft still claims that a 386 with 4 MB of RAM is enough to run Chicago, but people are skeptical. In September, Windows 95 is announced as the official name. We can also read that Windows 95 will get a built-in email client like Windows 3 had. With an Exchange server, you'll be able to get all your email into one inbox, even Internet Mail and X400. It'll also support embedding OLE2 objects into email, a cool feature which means that you can't view everything unless you also happen to have the software that created the objects. In October, Beta 2 is out, but there isn't any new information with it. Microsoft still hasn't made up its mind about MS-DOS 7 and is waiting for customer demand. In the press, however, we can read that full window drag has been taken out and font smoothing might also get taken out. Drive space is still in though. Beta 2 apparently contained OpenGL, but Microsoft said that might change. Ballmer publicly questions the need for MS-DOS 7. And Windows 95 is getting delayed. Major issues remain, like poor backwards compatibility with 16-bit apps, multitasking isn't working properly, and the general issue of just getting it all to run acceptably with 4 MB of RAM. By December, Microsoft licenses the Mosaic browser in their effort to not miss out on the World Wide Web. It seems likely that they will ship a browser with Windows 95. Their agreement prevented them from shipping it earlier than the launch of Windows 95. Microsoft is also going forwards with a plan of co-branding Office in the same way as Windows, releasing Office for Windows 95 to go with Windows 95. It's also announced that Windows 95 has been delayed to August 95. Looking at the board, and it's looking like most of the technological decisions was made already by the time media started covering Chicago. There's still a bit of misunderstandings in the press, but we're now on the home stretch. From this point on, it's mostly bug fixing left and a hype that needs building. In January of 95, we get some insight into their marketing strategy. The plan is to completely dominate the channel. Competitors shall not be visible. The line shall be huge from Akihabara to New York. It's now also public that Microsoft has licensed Mosaic, and that it intends to ship it with Windows 95. In the file manager of Windows 95, you can now undo copy, renames and deletions. Autorun, that thing where the software on a CD is automatically started when you put it in, is now a thing. Microsoft Network is also part of this beta, which is an ambitious attempt to add online and internet services straight into Windows. Microsoft Network itself is a walled garden type of service like AOL or CompuServe, but will later also offer internet connections. Microsoft also shows up Microsoft Bob, which is what they call a social user interface. It's even easier to use than Windows 95. It's only going to be sold in North America for now, but Microsoft intends to add social user interfaces to both Windows and Office. We'll later see this in Office with Clipit and the agent system in Windows XP. It's interesting to see Microsoft launching their own shell to replace the stock one when they didn't want OEMs to do that. This review of Bob concluded that if Bob is built into Windows, the market share of OS2 would likely increase. Jump to March, and Microsoft is planning a huge marketing push. They want complete and utter frenzy. Get the hype going. The next Windows 95 beta, the Milestone 8 build, is about to be shipped out. After that, a last big test with a preview release would happen before RTM. The Milestone 8 build will be tested by up to 400,000 people. Media coverage continues in April. Apparently the multitasking isn't quite there yet. I saw a claim that this was a fundamental design flaw, but once I looked further into the claim, it seems to just be a GDI handle leak in Explorer and a general attempt to praise OS2. Microsoft stood by its claim that Windows 95 does not need more memory than Windows 3.1 and that 4 megs is sufficient. A counter-argument used in press is that 4 MB of RAM isn't even enough on Windows 3.1. I guess the disconnect here is that reviewers used a baseline of using Microsoft Office or similar demanding program that was common in business at this point. Microsoft, meanwhile, probably thought that no one in their right mind would attempt to run Office on a 4 MB machine. I also start seeing some articles revealing that Windows 95 isn't some brand new OS written from scratch. It's still built on top of MS-DOS, and that MS-DOS is integrated in a way that just isn't as visible. I guess that this was a miscommunication that was bound to happen due to Microsoft distancing themselves from MS-DOS. Microsoft, most of the time, worded it as Windows 95 including DOS, not that it was built on top of DOS. Continuing into May, Microsoft does defend itself and explains that MS-DOS is still in Windows 95 for compatibility with all the software and drivers. Microsoft also claims to have found a resource leak or multi-threading bug that was previously reported on in the latest Milestone 8 build. Windows 95 is on track to be released on the 24th of August. We also get to hear about Plus for Windows 95. This is essentially what happened with the base premium discussions that Microsoft had internally to squeeze more profit out of Windows 95. Aside from a bunch of extra themes and a few utility programs, they also put some features that used to be in the beta there, like full window drag and font smoothing. The official reasoning seems to be that the base version needs to run on a 386 with 4 MB of RAM, and the Plus pack contains everything that wouldn't work on that. The Flipper game is, apparently, fun. In early June, we get the last bit of internal information. Microsoft still hasn't decided if they're going to use distribution media format for the floppy disk edition. DMF was a special floppy disk format that packed sectors tighter than normal to squeeze more data onto each disk. It was pretty much unusable as a read-write format, but as a read-only format it was deemed reliable enough. In a big test, it was found that Windows 95 was generally slower than Windows 3.1 on the same hardware, but not by a lot. So it didn't quite meet Microsoft's target of being the same or faster than Windows 3, but that was quite the ambitious goal anyway. Hop forwards to August, and its release month. In a way, it's not too surprising that Windows 95 is a bit slower than Windows 3 in tests. 32-bit code does use more RAM, even if the code itself is faster. Windows 95 itself is a compromise between low system requirements, DOS compatibility, and modern features like a 32-bit API and preemptive multitasking. It's mentioned in this article that Windows NT and OS2 have better multitasking. NT requires like 16 megs of RAM just to boot though. OS2 on the other hand is more of an apples to apples comparison, and OS2 is technically superior. As the release closes in, it's becoming increasingly clear that Microsoft is spending a lot on this launch. There had been rumors previously, but it was now known that Microsoft is spending about $200 million on marketing this launch, making it an absolutely massive launch event. That's more money than Microsoft spent developing the first version of Windows NT for context. The point was to drown out the voice of any competitor, and launched it was on August 24th, in the English-speaking world anyway. The launch wasn't simultaneous worldwide, and in Sweden it wasn't available until September 5th, while some regions had to wait even longer. Japan, for example, didn't get it until November that year. There was a whole tier list, but the most important thing is that we're ahead of Denmark. As the media then tries to sell it to the public, one of the big points they make is that it has twice the system resources available. In Windows 3.1, you could only open up so many apps before your system resources would run out. And this has nothing to do with the amount of available RAM. No, this is a finite resource, the limits of which are hard-coded into the operating system. On Windows 95, Microsoft doubled this value. More specifically, the resources in question are the heaps of the GDI and user system services. This is where GDI and window handles are allocated. The system information dialogues in Windows 3 and Windows 95 has something called system resources available. The percentage listed correlates to these heaps. As a result of the launch, the price of RAM rose significantly due to the unprecedented demand, and this kept going for several months afterwards. Theft also rose as RAM not only got more expensive, but also easier to sell on the grey and black markets. To sum it up, there was a lot of strategy behind this launch. It wasn't just about the money from people upgrading, it was about striking at competitors. It wasn't just IBM and OS2 that Microsoft was looking to crush. They were also targeting DR-DOS, Lotus Notes, and just Unix workstations in general. But something I didn't really see mentioned at all is Apples and Macs. The applications division made good money off the Mac platform thanks to Microsoft Office, so Microsoft seemingly wasn't too bothered with Apple. But that's all of the background out of the way. Let's get this thing installed on my FreeBSD. To get started, I really just have to go to the D drive in my file manager and run setup. It starts by running some checks on the system, and in this case it finds some contraband. Nothing that prevents us from continuing though. Since I'm upgrading, it makes sense to install in the same directory that I already have Windows in, but I guess my naming choice is starting to look a bit silly. We then get an opportunity to save our old system files in case we want to uninstall Windows 95. After previously clearing out a whole bunch of space for my OS2 attempt, I got plenty of space to burn now. So obviously I go for a custom setup. I get a chance to update the user information I put in when I first installed Windows 3.1, followed by a CD key prompt. And we'll let it scan for hardware. This will poke and prod the hardware in unusual places, which might cause the system to crash if we're unlucky. It's absolutely ripping the disk to shreds, as it's saving the progress between every device it probes for. In case the system crashes, it can then see which driver caused it and try not to load it next time. 5 nerve-wracking minutes later, we're out on the other side of the detection, and I can start selecting components. By the time I've selected the stuff I want, the projected space left isn't a whole lot, but it will do. I don't pay too much attention to the networking bits, as I'm not doing much networking currently. We then get a computer settings screen. This looks a lot like the system settings screen in MS-DOS and Windows 3, and it doesn't really fit the plug-and-play mantra of Windows 95. We do curiously enough have a setting for user interface. If I set this to Windows 3.1, maybe that uses less memory. I'll skip the startup disk, and we are at the copy step. As it goes, it shows some text blurbs about how great Windows 95 is and what's waiting for you at the other side. This is also when my Mitsumi single-speed CD-ROM drive and its dubious drivers really make themselves known. This copy step literally took 30 minutes. I seriously think it would have been faster to install the floppy disk edition instead. A restart later and we meet a barrage of settings. First, time zone. As you can see, this dialog predates the formation of the Great Polish Sea. As I install fax support, I also need to configure my phone number, but I can skip the modem configuration for now. We can also see that despite choosing Windows 3.1 as my user interface, we're in the new shell. Oh, there's the program manager. So all that option did was to add the old program manager to startup. Right. We can also see that the installation has finished with 14 megabytes of space to spare. One of the things the Windows installer did was to set the Windows partition to active, bypassing Lilo. So I go into fdisk and write this wrong. A quick peek into the device manager tells us that there are no identified but driverless devices. Not too surprising, there isn't really any exotic hardware in this old 386, at least not that I would expect Windows to know about. In the Performance tab, we can see that it does recommend getting more RAM. Windows 95 comes with a whole bunch of new desktop wallpapers, but for me, Windows 95 on a claustrophobic 640x480 monitor has always meant bubbles. I had some trouble getting the sound working, but it turned out being the old sound driver silently being loaded in the background. This caused a conflict, and I had to manually edit system.ini to get rid of the old driver. We can also see that file browsing defaults to opening up one window per directory, showing an icon view. This was a decision that was part of Microsoft's push to make Windows easy to use for beginners. Having a tree view and showing any kind of hierarchy was seen as too confusing for novice users, so they settled on this for the default configuration. Explorer was still available for those who had used a computer before. With Windows 95, we're finally free from the shackles of 8.3. We can use long file names to freely describe files. But I don't really have any fancy new Windows 95 applications to show right now. But Windows 95 is supposed to be backwards compatible with everything I already have, so let's check that out. Prince of Persia doesn't launch with the original shortcut that worked in Windows 3, so that's a dud. Just Jackrabbit, however, launch. It runs about the same as it did under plain DOS. That is kind of okay, but a bit uneven. I couldn't get Wolf 3D to launch in the default DOS box, but setting up a shortcut with some basic settings got it running. This Windows 3 game, Degeneration, works just fine. PaintShop Pro also seems fine, which I guess isn't that surprising. And so is Microsoft Works, although you'd kinda expect Microsoft programs to keep working. Looking at the old test files I created back in Windows 3, I can open most of them. The old write file shows fine in WordPad, complete with the embedded executable. The clipboard file doesn't open automatically, but the executable is still there for me to look at it with. The PCX format screenshot opens just fine in Paint. The calendar files open, and I was able to find the appointment I put in. Card file doesn't come with Windows 95, but as I upgrade it, it's still there and connected, so I can open that. Even the macro playback works, which was removed from the Windows 95 scope in favor of VBA scripting. I was also able to get my MS-DOS PCB editor going in DOS, in the high-resolution 800x600 mode and everything. As for the new features, well, technically video playback works, just not well. I didn't even bother with hover. But as for things not working, there's RipSpace, the utility I've been using to find out what's using all of my disk space. The long file names of Windows 95 appears to confuse it in a concerning way. But other than that, it's pretty well behaved. I have to say, Windows 95 does work quite well, and I would say compatibility with my old applications is quite good. My only real complaint is the performance. Even if it's only a little slower in Windows 3, the better window handling and ease of multitasking makes the poor performance so much more noticeable. I can totally see why they recommended 8 megs of RAM. But I think that will do for this video. This is also the end of the 1995 season, so it's gonna be a while until the next video is out. Feel free to subscribe and get notified when they start coming out. The next season will start with a new 1996 computer build, so I'm quite excited about that. But until then, thank you all for watching.